Hello, this is Professor Alexandria Lefay with a discussion of cultural studies as a lens for looking at literature. Before we talk about cultural studies itself, let's first look at a poem, Socratic by Jacqueline Jones Lamond. The students know the agenda. When I step inside our classroom, the PowerPoint is loaded, the student presenting her report stands poised to begin. And so she does. This day is her second try, the first awash due to our failed technology. I ask, do you think you will earn another chance each time air is out of your hands? This day, a new day, she stands confident, prepared for questions from her peers. The one question she's noted that I ask of all of them: What is it that this artist has allowed you to achieve? This day, I forget the other questions. I always wait to ask. This day, they ask no others. Just stare outside at the lot of parked cars. Play with the ends of their hair. They want to hear voices that give them reason to listen. They want the blare of a car horn, tires screeching without a final thud. They want a lecture, a formula that does it all, a recitation of the method that always gets things done. And one woman says it, that she is sad. And all of them nod, and another says that she is angry too. And how could they not indict? And why won't justice ever be served? And why won't anyone do anything to change the America in which we live? And I look at my classroom, the brown, the black, and the white of my room, and I ask, who is it that must make the change we need? And they talk about the government. They talk about the system. They talk about our economics and our judges and our juries. And they tell me of their lives, their fears, their boyfriends and their fathers, our illnesses and our poverty, their rights and their desires, and how none of us are ever safe. And the room becomes the last surrender while they wait for me to teach. I say, this is the part where you wait for me to synthesize your words, then tell you what to do. And every face grows hopeful, just as we all did the night before we knew what we've always known, that knowing the truth doesn't save us. And I take a sip of water and tell them every true thing I know, that they are the power who will save what needs saving, then answer their next questions with more and more questions, asking until time is up. There's a poet by the name of Billy Collins, and he talks about poetry or a poem as a house. It was a poem that you can walk inside and explore and understand and experience. Now that house is open. If the poem, on the other hand, is very hard to understand, that it doesn't feel like you could move around inside it, then that house is closed or locked. There are many reasons that poems are hard to understand. One is you don't have a lot of experience reading poetry. Another, the words themselves are hard to understand, or the references the poem makes to other parts of our society. For instance, there's a reference in this poem to failing to indict. It's referring to specific events in U.S. history, contemporary history, in fact. If we don't know what it's referring to, we may not fully understand the poem. But the reality is, no poem has only one meaning. All poems have many meanings. And we'll explore some of the reasons why in our discussion of cultural studies. But for now, think about this poem, Socratic, as a house. Explore each room. How does it feel to be inside this poem? To listen to it, to explore what it means. What does it mean to you? What was the author's intent in creating it? You can take some time to reread the poem and consider it again. Now, let's talk about cultural studies. Cultural studies is a study of how a society creates and shares meaning. So, a lot of times when we use words, we don't really consider where they come from. For instance, one of my favorite words is weird. Boy, is that weird. When Shakespeare was writing, hundreds of years ago, weird meant faded, like it was meant to be. That's not at all the way we use the word weird now. The reason, well, you could blame it on Willie. Shakespeare, that is. Many of the words we use in contemporary English have been altered by Shakespeare himself. Well, not exactly Shakespeare. For instance, he used weird in a play to mean unusual, strange, something is afoot. It's in the play Tempest, I believe. In any case, because his plays have been read and reread, performed and performed again throughout Western culture, the way he used language often became standard. As a result, weird means weird. You know what I mean? In other words, literature is one of the ways a society creates and shares meaning. So, cultural studies is studying how society creates these meanings and spreads them. We specifically in this class are using cultural studies to talk about how literature can create and share meaning. But in order to do that, we need to know more about the 5 principles of cultural studies. They are, number 1, reality is a social construction. Okay, so you're like, wait a minute. If I'm sitting in a chair, the chair is real. It's not a social construction. You're right, but the fact that you call it a chair and not silla is because of the culture you were raised in, or perhaps the languages you've learned. For instance, some of you may know it as un silla, una silla, lo siento. Others may have another word altogether. Recently, I asked my daughter to get her coat. She said, "Nope, I'm getting my jacket." What's the difference between a coat and a jacket? Well, that part of reality is culturally constructed. The way we see the world around us is determined by the culture that raised us. Take, for example, the Athabascan view of self. Around World War II, a teacher from England moved to Alaska, and many of her students were from the indigenous nation of Athabasca. And those children had no concept of their self-image. I don't mean psychologically, I mean physically. They never looked in a reflective surface to know what they look like. So when their teacher took photographs and shared them with her students, the students laughed and pointed at their classmates, and then pointed at themselves and said, "Who is that?" Because they had never seen themselves. In our Southie crazy culture, that's kind of a weird concept. Oh, there's that word again. Weird. Anyway, let's look at what it means to say, "Oh, that's weird," when looking at another culture. That topic will come up after we discuss the first 5 tenets of cultural studies. The first one again, reality is a social construct. Well, if reality is a social construct, or our perception of it anyway, then identity is a social construct too. How we see ourselves, whether or not we chastise ourselves or have pride or fear, the things we know of ourselves are often determined by the culture in which we're raised. Take, for example, the view of women. In Europe, in the 1600s, Germany specifically, there was a young woman by the name of Marie Merian. She loved art. She also loved bugs. In that time period, the reality of bugs was, we didn't know much. In fact, many people thought bugs sprouted in raw meat or were spawns of the devil. They knew very little about the lifespan and origin of bugs. In fact, not everyone knew that a caterpillar became a butterfly. Well, part of what we know about bugs in the world today is a result of Marie Merian. Even though being an artist and being a woman was not generally allowed in the 1600s of Germany, she did it anyway. Her father was an artist, many of her siblings were artists, so she too became an artist. And what did she draw? Bugs. In fact, there's a great children's book about her named The Girl Who Drew Butterflies. She created amazingly beautiful and detailed illustrations and descriptions of the lifespan of bugs and created them in books. As a result, she made enough money to be able to live on her own and have her own studio, which was extremely rare in the 1600s in Germany. She also created enough work that her illustrations became the foundation for one of the first modern art museums in Europe. It was purchased by the government of Russia and became the first public art museum in St. Petersburg, Germany, or Russia. Now, if reality is socially constructed, what is allowed or not allowed, what is accepted or unaccepted, is determined by cultural entities within a society. And every group in society wants to be able to define their own sense of identity and their own sense of reality. There is going to be a struggle. And that struggle for power is very marked in our society today. We can see this in the conflict from country to country. We can see this within the struggle within a given country between different ethnic groups, between different age groups, between different genders. And it is important to recognize that literature is often used within this structure to help people self-define, to protest against things they think are wrong, to change people's minds. The next principle of cultural studies is beliefs can create an incomplete view of reality. It's important to know that what we believe to be true may not actually be the whole truth. And a lot of times our beliefs can shape our view of reality. If this is true, then sometimes we need to commit ourselves to seeing around our beliefs, to looking at the full complexity of what the world is like, not just from our perspective, but from the perspective of others. Speaking of perspective, a lot of times we reflect our perspective on reality through the language that we choose. Language creates an identity for the sender and the receiver. Take, for instance, there are people in this world who call me mom. That creates an identity for me and for them. There are much darker versions of how language can create identity. For instance, when I lived in Memphis, Tennessee, was the first time I was ever called a Yankee. I was bringing my car to the shop to have something fixed, and I was also in a hurry because I had somewhere else I had to get to. The guy behind the counter, who literally was named Bubba, said, "Hey, Clem, this Yankee girl wants me to hurry." That instantly created an identity for the person who said it and for me. We need to recognize when the language we use creates an identity and what that identity says about us and the person we're speaking to or about. We also need to think about the identity that is being created in the language used in a piece of literature. One of the other things you need to know about me, the way I teach, is that I teach from a perspective of radical multiculturalism. Now, I want to point out there are a lot of thoughts people may have about the word radical. Radical simply means a commitment to change. Radical multiculturalism is committed to changing the way multiculturalism is viewed in our society today. Radical multiculturalists believe that the only way to end discrimination is through the intentional deconstruction of the concept of the other through the use of an emic perspective. You may be thinking, say that again. Was that in English? I'm not really sure what that means. Again, it creates an identity for the sender and the receiver. Let's look at this again. The only way to end discrimination is acting upon an incorrect belief about someone else. The only way to end discrimination is through the intentional taking apart or deconstruction of the concept of the other. We'll look at what that means in just a second. The way to do this is through the use of the emic perspective. What's an emic perspective? Allow me to explain. The other, or othering, is the process of seeing or defining someone or something as other than yourself through the use of an us versus them comparison. Remember back then when we were talking about Apabaskin's inability to recognize a vision of themselves? And we thought, how weird. Well, for those of us who did think that, it is because we othered them. We thought of them as different than ourselves. We looked at them in a comparison between us and them. It is much better to look at them from an emic perspective. What's that, you say? Well, looking at an element of culture from the perspective of someone within that culture. It's an insider look. So rather than looking at Apabaskan culture from a perspective outside of that culture, why not look at how the Apabaskans see themselves? For instance, what does it mean that a culture doesn't look at what they physically look like? It doesn't emphasize physical appearance because other things are more important. That may be different from the way we were raised, but we shouldn't judge them based on our own experiences. We should judge them based on their experiences. Now, after you've learned these things about cultural studies as a lens to look at literature, look at the poem Socratic again. How does your view of the poem change now that you've heard this lecture? What is the poem trying to say about reality and the power struggle within society? Does it explore issues of identity, belief, language? How so? I want you to consider the same text from before you learned about cultural studies and after, so that you understand how cultural studies, the introduction or reintroduction of it, has changed your view of this piece of literature. Thank you for listening.